Hey guys, tonight we're walking barefoot on a dry, sun-baked path somewhere near the shores of the Red Sea. About 75,000 years ago, the air is sharp with salt and hot dust, the kind that clings to your skin no matter how many times you brush it off. To the west, the low hills shimmer in the afternoon heat. To the east, you can hear the soft rhythmic hiss of waves pulling back from a pebbled shore. A small group of people is gathered around a flat slab of rock, passing something from hand to hand. Tiny, glinting shells, pierced through so a cord can slip easily inside. They're not for food, they're not for tools, they're something else entirely, the first currency of human connection. No coins yet, no gold, no silk caravans stretching over horizons. Just a bead, small enough to fit on your fingertip, but valuable enough to travel farther than you will in your lifetime. And here's the thing, you probably won't survive this age without knowing how to trade. The climate is fickle, resources are patchy, and strangers are as likely to share a drink with you as they are to run you off their land. Beads. They help tip the odds in your favor. If you're here for the full journey into the great bead roads of the Stone Age, you're in the right place. Let's follow those tiny treasures from one coast to the other. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what's the local time right now? I want to see how far our own network stretches. So get comfortable, relax your shoulders, and picture the world before metal, before writing, before cities. Tonight, the beads will take us farther than you think. The earliest long-distance trade in human history wasn't about grain, obsidian, or hides. It was about objects so small you could lose them in the sand with one careless flick of your hand. Across the Paleolithic world, people began collecting, shaping, and carrying beads across incredible distances. This wasn't just an idle pastime, it was an act of connection. Archaeologists today point to sites like Blombo's Cave in South Africa, where nacreous shell beads over 70,000 years old were buried deep in sediment. These weren't local shells, they came from the sea, carried inland by someone's deliberate choice, and because these shells were pierced in nearly identical ways, we can tell they were crafted to be worn or displayed. Think of the effort, finding the shells, transporting them, drilling them without cracking the delicate surface, then polishing them so they caught the light just right. That's not an accident, that's an industry. We tend to think of roads as hard fixed lines, stone-paved Roman highways, or rutted cart tracks worn by centuries of wheels. The bead roads of the Stone Age weren't like that. They were shifting, seasonal, and as changeable as the people who used them. One year a path might skirt a riverbank rich in fish. A few decades later a drought might push travelers into the highlands instead, but the beads still move. If you were lucky, you might see a shell from the Red Sea hanging around the neck of someone who lived in the mountains of modern-day Ethiopia, or a stone bead carved from turquoise turning up hundreds of miles from the only known deposit. What's remarkable is that these tiny items carried stories along with them. A bead wasn't just a piece of decoration, it was proof you'd met someone from far away, proof you had connections beyond the immediate horizon, proof you belonged to a network bigger than your own campfire circle. In an age when survival depended on who you knew as much as what you could hunt, that proof could mean the difference between welcome and hostility. Imagine walking into a new settlement, the firelight flickering over a half-dozen unfamiliar faces. No one knows if you're friend or foe, but they see the shells at your throat, shells they recognize from a trading partner 2 valleys away. Suddenly you're not a stranger, you're someone who knows so-and-so. That's how the bead roads worked, not as maps on the ground but as invisible threads linking people across landscapes that to us seem impossibly vast for such early travelers. We can even trace the spread of certain styles. Some beads bear the same symmetrical drill marks, the same polish patterns, even when they're found hundreds of kilometers apart. This tells us there were shared techniques, maybe even shared teachers. Someone might have taught another group how to work a stone so that it gleamed, and that knowledge traveled right along with the beads themselves. Of course, carrying beads wasn't risk-free. If you were moving along one of these early trade paths, you weren't strolling down a safe country lane, you were navigating territories claimed by others, places where water might be scarce and predators were more than just a background worry, and yet, people kept making the journeys. The value was worth the risk. Over time, these exchanges began to weave together what we might call proto-networks, patterns of regular contact that in a way prefigure the global trade routes of much later history. By mapping where certain bead types have been found, archaeologists can guess the likely corridors of movement, coastal trails along East Africa, inland paths that followed game migrations, river crossings that doubled as trading points. It's a kind of detective work with every bead a clue. And the best part, these tiny artifacts have survived when wood, textiles and even bone have long since vanished. A bead can last tens of thousands of years, holding on to its shape and color even when the rest of a camp has turned to dust. They are like time capsules, whispering across ages about who met whom, who traveled where, and how the first sparks of long-distance connection lit up the human story. The Great Bead Roads weren't just about pretty things, they were about trust, about recognition, about turning a meeting between strangers into an opportunity instead of a threat, and in a time when the world was wide, wild, and often dangerous, that was worth more than anything. So here we are, standing at the start of these ancient pathways, watching the first traders move out across the land with their small but precious cargo. Those beads will travel farther than you can imagine, carried by calloused hands, tucked into leather pouches, sewn into clothing, or strung around necks as proof of identity. And the story of where they'll go next, that's where we head from here. The oldest beads we know of don't just tell us where people went, they tell us when this all began. Archaeology gives us snapshots, tiny glimpses into lives that unfolded tens of thousands of years before writing, and in those snapshots, beads appear almost shockingly early. Over in North Africa, at Tafraolt Cave in Morocco, similar shells, same genus, different species, have been uncovered and dated to around 82,000 years ago. Again, they show identical patterns of human modification, puncture marks near the tip, wear along the edges, where a cord would have passed, and traces of red ochre staining. That ochre wasn't an accident, it was applied intentionally, turning the pale shell into something more striking. If you've ever painted a room just to make it feel more yours, you can appreciate the impulse. By 50,000 years ago, beads were showing up in multiple continents. In Israel's School and Kafse caves, perforated shells date back to about 100,000 years, though some researchers argue for slightly younger dates. What matters is the pattern. In different regions, often separated by hundreds or even thousands of kilometers, people were doing the same thing, collecting small, durable, portable objects and modifying them in a consistent way. It's not coincidence, it's culture. And the variety of materials only grew over time. Shells were common in coastal regions, naturally, but inland groups turned to whatever they had. Ostrich egg-shell beads became especially popular in parts of Africa. If you've ever handled an ostrich egg, you know the shell is thick, perfect for shaping and polishing into uniform discs. Some of these bead strings, when reassembled, contain hundreds of pieces, each one painstakingly drilled and smoothed. Stone beads emerged in areas rich with colorful minerals. Carnelian, a reddish-orange chalcedony, traveled widely in prehistory. Turquoise, malachite and lapis lazuli appeared in later networks, but had their early debuts in localized forms. Then there were beads made of teeth, animal or even human, often signaling a deeper symbolic meaning, possibly tied to hunting prowess or ancestral connections. Bone beads were another staple. Flexible to work with, readily available, and able to take on polish, they could be carved into cylinders, discs, or even tiny figurines. And every choice shell, stone, tooth, bone carried a message. You didn't wear beads just because they were pretty, you wore them because they said something about you, your connections and your place in the world. The origins of these beads also reveal something else: movement. If you find a marine shell far inland, you know there's been travel or exchange. If you see identical drill patterns on ostrich eggshell beads in camps hundreds of kilometers apart, you know there's been a flow of ideas and skills. Archaeologists call this material culture, but in practice it's human culture shaped by the need to belong, impress, negotiate, or simply be remembered. You can picture the scenes: a young woman bending over a shell with a pointed stone tool, tapping carefully until the hole forms without cracking the delicate curve. An elder showing a group of apprentices how to grind an eggshell bead against a slab of sandstone until it's perfectly smooth. A traveler arriving from days away, shaking out a leather pouch onto the ground, spilling a glittering scatter of shells, seeds and polished bone. The persistence of bead making over tens of thousands of years suggests it wasn't a fad, it was a core element of how humans expressed themselves. Even today, we still adorn ourselves with jewelry, much of it meaningless in terms of survival, but deeply meaningful in terms of identity. The impulse is the same, only the materials have changed. What makes these earliest beads so important to our story of the Great Bead Roads is that they show the starting point. They show the birth of a tradition that would eventually stretch across continents. Before there were silk caravans, or spice fleets, before there were gold coins or gemstone markets, there were these tiny portable tokens of connection. And because they were small, they could slip across borders, if we can even call them borders, without the need for bulky transport or complex trade arrangements. One traveler could carry hundreds of beads in a pouch, each one destined to change hands many times before settling, finally in a grave or being lost to the soil. They also weathered time remarkably well. In many ancient sites, organic materials, wood, fibers, hides, have rotted away entirely, but a bead, whether stone, shell or hardened eggshell, can sit in the ground for tens of millennia, still shining faintly under a layer of dust. It's why they're so invaluable to archaeologists today. They are the fingerprints of an ancient social network, one that stretched farther than we might have imagined possible for people without wheels, writing or permanent roads. So when we talk about the Great Bead Roads, we start here with the first sparks of this practice, the first time someone looked at a shell and thought, this isn't just for eating, this is for wearing, the first time that shell traveled inland, passed through multiple hands, and became part of someone else's life, the first time a bead was valued not for what it could do, but for what it could mean. Those moments, quiet, deliberate and repeated for thousands of years, are the foundation of everything that comes next. And ostrich eggshell beads from the savannah, all lying within the same layer of soil. This tells us that those locations weren't just temporary camps, they were crossroads where different worlds overlapped. In many ways, the movement of bead materials was like a prehistoric version of a global supply chain. Each link in the chain added something, a polish here, a dye there, a new cord strung to replace one that wore out. By the time a bead reached its final destination, it might look very different from when it first left the source. Coastal shells were a favorite in many inland communities precisely because they carried a whiff of the exotic. Imagine being in a settlement 1,000 kilometers from the ocean, never having seen a shoreline, and someone shows you a smooth spiraled shell the color of sunset. You wouldn't just be looking at a bead, you'd be looking at a piece of a far-off, almost mythical place. And for the coastal people who traded them away, they might have received in return rare stone flakes from mountains they'd never seen, or resin from trees that didn't grow anywhere near the salty air of the sea. The choice of materials was also practical. Certain stones were not just pretty, they were tough. A bead carved from quartz or chalcedony could last through decades of wear, surviving the rigors of travel, weather and daily life. This durability made them reliable as trade goods. Nobody wanted to arrive at a trading spot with goods that crumbled in their pouch. Color played a role too. Bright reds, blues, and greens stood out against the muted tones of hides and skins that made up most clothing. In a world without chemical dyes, finding something naturally vivid was a big deal. The rich reds of carnelian or the green shimmer of malachite would have drawn eyes immediately, making the wearer stand out in a crowd. Some materials even had what we might call built-in stories. A tooth from a dangerous predator wasn't just a bead, it was a status symbol, proof, real or claimed, that the wearer or their kin had faced something deadly. The same went for certain shells that could only be harvested during dangerous tides or from treacherous reefs. The distance these materials traveled is staggering when you consider the conditions. No roads, no wheels, no pack animals in most regions at the time. Every step was on foot. Every load carried on human backs. And yet, over generations, the same types of beads and bead materials show up in regions separated by mountains, deserts, and swamps. This was possible because the networks weren't linear, they were web-like. Instead of one straight route from coast to inland, there were multiple overlapping paths, with goods moving in different directions depending on the season, the weather, and the shifting alliances between groups. And just as importantly, the exchange wasn't always immediate or direct. You might trade a bead for food in one season, only for that bead to lie unused until the next big gathering months later. Beads had the patience to wait for the right moment. When archaeologists analyze the distribution of bead materials, they see patterns that hint at surprisingly sophisticated logistics for such an early era. It wasn't chaotic. People knew who to meet, when to meet them, and what would be valuable to them. It might not have been a road in the physical sense, but in social terms it was a well-worn path. Over time, these material exchanges did more than just move pretty objects around. They linked ecosystems. The coast, the forest, the savanna, and the mountains all became connected in a web of trade, with beads serving as both currency and messenger. And the more valuable and rare the material, the farther it seemed willing to travel. The great bead roads began here, with these first, improbable journeys of shells, stones, eggshell, and bone, carried step by step across a Stone Age world that was far more connected than we often imagine. If you've ever tried to drill a hole through a seashell with nothing but a sharp rock, you know it's not exactly a weekend hobby. Bead making in the Stone Age was a test of patience, precision, and persistence. Three things that, let's be honest, aren't exactly in high supply when you're also trying to dodge predators and find dinner, and yet across continents and millennia, people committed themselves to this craft. It started with choosing the right raw material. Not every shell, stone or bone was worth the effort. A bead maker would look for pieces with good color, interesting texture, and crucially durability. Too thin, and the bead might shatter under drilling. Too brittle, and it would crumble before it ever saw a string. If you were working with stone, you'd want something that could take a polish, carnelian, quartz, or even basalt in some regions. If it was shell, you'd need one thick enough to survive the piercing process but not so thick that it dulled your tools. And tools, oh the tools. In the early days, a sharp flake of flint or chert was your go-to drill. You didn't spin it with a machine, you held it in your fingers, twisting, scraping and grinding until you bored a hole through. Later, more advanced methods came along, bow drills for example, where a cord wrapped around the drill shaft could be drawn back and forth to spin the point quickly. But those innovations took time to appear, and even with them, bead making wasn't fast. A single stone bead might take hours, even days, to shape and pierce. After drilling came shaping. Beads rarely came out of the raw material in perfect wearable form. Stone beads were often ground against a flat slab of sandstone to smooth edges and refine shape. Shell beads needed their sharp edges blunted so they wouldn't cut skin or cord. Ostrich eggshell discs had to be perfectly uniform if they were to look good strung together, so bead makers might lay out dozens on a flat surface, checking for size and symmetry before final polishing. Polishing was the secret to making a bead truly shine, literally. Rubbing the bead with fine sand, leather or even plant fibers could transform a dull surface into something that caught the light. This wasn't just aesthetic. In many cultures, sheen was associated with value and prestige. The brighter the bead, the more impressive it looked at gatherings or in trade negotiations. Color enhancement was another technique that popped up early. Red ochre, a natural iron oxide pigment, was a favorite for staining beads. Some beads were rolled in ochre dust, while others were rubbed with a paste made by mixing ochre with animal fat. This gave a warm, earthy tone that lasted for years. In some cases, repeated wear against skin darkened or polished the surface even more, giving older beads a patina that marked them as well-traveled and valuable. What's striking is how consistent certain methods were across vast distances. Beads, found thousands of kilometers apart, often bear the same drilling angles, edge finishes, or staining techniques. That means knowledge was traveling alongside the beads themselves. You could think of it as the Stone Age equivalent of trade secrets in a craft guild, only these secrets weren't locked away, they were shared, passed on, and adapted by new hands. It's also worth noting that bead making wasn't just a functional job, it was social. Picture a small group gathered near a hearth at the end of the day, each person working on their own pieces while chatting, singing or telling stories. Beads might be made in batches, with multiple people contributing to the same set that would eventually be traded away. This collaborative nature made them more than just personal ornaments, they were products of a community. For some, bead making may have been a full-time role, especially in regions where trade was brisk. A skilled beadmaker's work could earn the group valuable resources, food during lean times, raw materials they couldn't find locally, or tools that improved daily survival. That kind of economic power could give a craftsperson higher status, even if they never traveled the trade routes themselves. The irony is that the people making the most beautiful beads might never see the far-off lands where their creations ended up. A bead could pass through a dozen hands before it reached its final wearer, crossing mountains and deserts while its maker remained in the same familiar camp. And yet, through their work they were part of something much bigger, a network of exchange that stitched together a vast, scattered world. The dedication to perfecting these techniques tells us just how much value was placed on beads in Stone Age life. They weren't throwaway items. Each one represented hours of labor, skill, and cultural knowledge. To hold one was to hold a piece of human time and attention, condensed into a small, gleaming object. And once those beads were ready, smoothed and shining, they were destined for the next stage of their journey, the hands of a traveler, setting out to trade them for something equally precious. Our waiting continued. Before the bead roads stretched across continents, they started close to home. Early bead trade was at first a neighborhood affair, if we can call a neighborhood a cluster of hunter-gatherer camps, spread across valleys, riverbanks, and hillsides. You didn't wake up one day and decide to walk 500 kilometers for a trade meeting. No, you began by swapping with the people you already knew. Picture this, a late afternoon gathering, at the edge of a small clearing. Two groups meet. Maybe they share a language, maybe they only understand each other through gesture. They've arrived because the rains have brought herds to the nearby plains, and with the animals come opportunities for both hunting and trading. After the food exchanges and introductions, someone produces a string of gleaming ostrich eggshell beads. In return, they might receive a bundle of dried fish, a finely made stone blade, or a pouch of medicinal herbs found only in the hills. These small local exchanges had two big effects. First, they built trust. Repeated trades between the same groups laid the groundwork for alliances, important in a world where a stranger could be either a trading partner or a threat. Second, they set the stage for expansion. Once a group learned that certain goods, like specific bead types, were valued by their neighbors, they began looking further afield for materials to make them. Seasonal migrations often created the perfect setting for these exchanges. People followed animal herds, moved to better fishing spots, or shifted camps to escape the dry season. These movements brought them into contact with other groups, sometimes repeatedly over years. Beads traded in one season could reappear in another, worn by someone new or bundled into another trade entirely. In this way, the same bead might make a slow journey outward, hopscotching from camp to camp. Certain families or individuals became known for having the good stuff. Maybe they had access to a coastal shellbed no one else could reach safely, or they knew where to find a seam of bright carnelian in the hills. These people became the early middlemen, though middle person is probably more accurate, linking their neighbors with resources from beyond their immediate range. And here's the key: once you had a few of these trusted intermediaries, the bead roads began to grow. A trade might start between two closely connected groups, but over time, it extended to those groups' neighbors, and then their neighbors' neighbors. Eventually, the people on either end of the exchange had never met, yet they were connected through a chain of trades, with beads traveling farther than either party could have imagined. These local networks also served as testing grounds for bead styles and values. A particular shell type or stone color might be wildly popular in one region but ignored in another. Traders quickly learned what worked where. If bright red beads drew attention inland, then those became the priority for that route. If certain patterns held symbolic meaning in a specific culture, traders would adapt, offering designs that fit local tastes. Sometimes the exchanges weren't purely economic. Beads could be part of ceremonial gifts during rites of passage, marriage agreements, or peace treaties. Giving someone a set of beads was more than handing over a pretty object. It was sealing a relationship. That bond might mean safe passage in the future, help during a food shortage, or allies in a dispute. And this is where the transformation began. The more these bonds spread, the more people saw the benefit of trading beyond the familiar. If you could get something rare and beautiful from a group 3 valleys over, why not try 4 valleys? Why not follow the river downstream to see who lives along its banks? Each successful trip, each friendly meeting, made the idea of going farther seem less dangerous and more rewarding. By the time these small local exchanges had matured, they had already laid the foundation for something much larger. They had created not just trade habits, but trade expectations. People came to gatherings ready to exchange, knowing what goods they had to offer and what they hoped to receive. Beads were central to that process, portable, valuable, and instantly recognizable as a sign of wealth and connection. The first bead roads weren't carved into the earth. They were worn into human memory, routes known by heart, passed down in stories, and reinforced every time someone returned from a journey with new treasures in their pouch. Soon these remembered paths would link up, stretching farther than anyone in those first local trades could have imagined. The great bead roads were about to take their first long strides into the wider world. If you were to look down at the Stone Age world from above, not on a modern map, but as a scatter of rivers, coastlines, mountains, and animal migration routes, you'd start to see faint lines forming. These weren't paved highways or carved trails, they were memory paths, the sum of countless footsteps taken by traders, foragers, and wanderers who carried beads and other goods between distant lands. This is what we mean when we talk about mapping the Great Bead Roads. Archaeologists don't have actual maps from 50,000 years ago, but we do have something just as revealing: the locations of bead finds and the geological clues inside them. When you discover a bead made from a shell that only exists on a particular coast, and it turns up hundreds of kilometers inland, you can start drawing a mental line between the two. Do that enough times, with enough finds, and you begin to trace the ancient corridors of exchange. One of the most prominent of these corridors in Africa seems to have followed the East African Rift Valley. This immense geographic feature is essentially a natural travel route. It's lined with freshwater lakes, fertile plains, and consistent, seasonal game migrations. If you were carrying beads from the Indian Ocean coast inland, or ostrich egg-shell beads from the interior toward the coast, this was the road you took. In North Africa, similar patterns emerge. Beads from Mediterranean shells show up deep in the Sahara, suggesting traders once followed ancient riverbeds and oases, hopping from one water source to another. It's easy to imagine a chain of small camps, each within a day's walk of the next, like beads themselves strung along a desert necklace. Other routes hugged coastlines. Along the Red Sea, for example, coastal foragers could move up and down the shore, trading with both inland groups and others along the water. Here, the sea was less a barrier than a guide. It kept you fed with shellfish and fish while you carried your trade goods. Inland mountain passes also played their part. High-altitude paths in places like the Ethiopian highlands or the Atlas Mountains may have been seasonal, but when they were open, they offered shortcuts between otherwise isolated valleys. Beads could cross entire climate zones in a matter of weeks this way, moving from tropical lowlands to alpine ridges and back down into temperate plains. What's striking about these routes is how they often followed the same logic as much later trade networks. Find the safest, most resource-rich path, and repeat it until it becomes tradition. Even without permanent markers, these routes persisted. Children learned them from elders, who had learned them from their elders before. Of course, not all bead movement was along a single road. Many finds suggest a branching network, with multiple possible paths between source and destination. This web-like structure had a major advantage. If one route was blocked by conflict, drought, or dangerous animal migrations, traders could reroute their journey along an alternate path. This adaptability kept the bead roads alive for thousands of years. And as we map these routes through the lens of archaeology, certain hubs stand out. These weren't cities, there were no cities yet, but they were major meeting points. Sometimes they were geographic crossroads, like the junction of two rivers. Other times they were seasonal resource sites, like a salt flat that dried just enough to be harvested at the same time every year. In these places, beads didn't just pass through, they piled up. Archaeologists often find richer deposits of bead artifacts in such hubs, indicating that these were long-standing trade fairs where multiple groups met and exchanged goods. The remarkable thing is that these pathways were entirely organic. No ruler planned them, no government taxed them, no military guarded them. They existed because they worked, because they met a deep human need for connection, beauty, and the security that comes from having something valuable to offer a stranger. And once a path proved itself, once people knew you could get from point A to point B without dying of thirst or getting eaten, it became more than a way to move goods. It became a line of trust, memory, and expectation. The great bead roads, though invisible to the eye, were as real to their travelers as any stone-paved Roman road would be tens of thousands of years later. From here our story will follow those routes into the places where the magic happened, where beads weren't just moving, they were changing hands, changing meanings, and changing the relationships between people who might otherwise have remained strangers. If the great bead roads had a pulse, you'd find it beating strongest at the seasonal gatherings, temporary hubs of noise, barter, and human energy where trade came alive. These were not permanent markets with stalls and walls. They were open-air meeting grounds that might exist for only a few days or weeks, yet leave echoes in memory for years. The timing of these gatherings was everything. They were often anchored to seasonal events, the ripening of certain fruits, the peak of fish migrations, the end of a rainy season when rivers ran low enough to cross. Sometimes they coincided with communal hunts, where multiple groups came together to bring down large game like wildebeest or even mammoth, pooling resources and sharing the feast. And once the bellies were full, attention turned to other appetites, like the hunger for goods you couldn't make yourself. Picture it, a wide, trampled clearing near a bend in a river. Dozens of small fires smoke in the dusk, each one surrounded by groups speaking in a patchwork of dialects. Some people are laying out hides and baskets, others unroll bundles of obsidian blades, resin lumps, or dried herbs. And then there's the bead trade, the part that draws the most wandering eyes. Strings of ostrich eggshell beads hang over branches like pale constellations. Small piles of shells gleam on woven mats, each one drilled and smoothed. Carnelian discs catch the last light of the day, glowing as if they've trapped a piece of sunset. You can almost hear the subtle shift in a crowd when a particularly rare set of beads is unwrapped. Voices pause, heads turn, and the bargaining begins. The trades themselves weren't just silent exchanges of goods, they were performances. A skilled trader might start high, praising the rarity and beauty of their beads, dropping hints about the distant places they came from. The buyer would counter, feigning disinterest, maybe pointing out a tiny flaw in the polish. Eventually the deal was struck, sometimes with a handshake, sometimes sealed with shared food or drink, turning the exchange into the beginning of a relationship rather than the end of a transaction. These gatherings were also information exchanges. Alongside goods, people traded stories, news of distant relatives, rumors of rich hunting grounds, and warnings about droughts or unfriendly neighbors. Beads could carry messages in themselves. Wearing a certain style or color might signal an alliance, a shared heritage, or a marital connection to another group. The bead roads depended on these fairs to keep their networks fresh. Without regular face-to-face meetings, the chain of exchanges would fray. But with each seasonal gathering, the web was rewoven tighter, new links formed, and old ones reinforced. A trader who had met someone here last year could look forward to seeing them again, building the kind of trust that made long-distance trade possible. The gatherings weren't all business either. They were social events, full of music, dance, and matchmaking. Many marriages were arranged or sealed at these meetings, with beads often part of the bridwealth or dowry. In some cultures, a young man might present a string of beads to a woman as both a gift and a declaration. If she wore them the next day, it meant yes. If they turned up quietly in his pack when he left, well, that was a no, but at least a polite one. For bead makers, these were high-pressure opportunities. A well-received design could spread rapidly along the trade routes, with other makers copying and adapting it in their own styles. Conversely, a style that drew little interest might vanish within a season or two, replaced by new trends. In this way, the fairs were the Stone Age's version of fashion weeks, places where new ideas in ornamentation could debut and spread. Even the location of these gatherings could shift over time. If a river changed course or a key resource became scarce, the meeting place might move to a better spot. But wherever they happened, they were more than just temporary markets. They were the living nodes of the great bead roads, the moments when an invisible network of exchanges became visible in firelight, song, and the gleam of worked stone and shell. As night fell on these trading grounds, you could walk between the fires and see necklaces changing hands, hear laughter as deals were struck, and feel the buzz of connection in the air. And when everyone packed up to leave, the beads would begin their next journey, carried along the paths we've been following, linking people who might never meet but who shared a common thread around their necks. If you've ever worn something that made you feel different, sharper, bolder, more noticed, you already understand part of why beads mattered so much. In the Stone Age, beads weren't just pretty, they were signals. Every material, shape, and arrangement told a story about who you were, where you came from, and what connections you held. Across the great bead roads, certain designs became visual shorthand for identity. In one region, a string of white ostrich eggshell discs might mark you as part of a particular clan. In another, a necklace alternating red carnelian and black stone could signal your role as a skilled hunter or a respected elder. Sometimes the meaning was subtle, known only to insiders. Other times, it was meant to shout across a crowd, "This is who I am." The social role of beads was layered. On one level, they were adornment, ornaments that caught the light, made your movements more noticeable, and simply pleased the eye. But on another, they were declarations of status. A longer string might show wealth, a rare material might prove connections to distant lands, and an unusual design could hint at personal achievement or lineage. Beads also carried symbolic meanings that tied into spiritual life. In many communities, certain colors or materials were associated with protection, fertility, or good fortune. A bead made from the tooth of a powerful predator might be worn as a charm against danger, while shells from the ocean could be linked to ideas of abundance or renewal. The meanings weren't universal, but they were powerful within their own contexts. Marriage and courtship added another layer. Beads often featured in proposals, dowries, and wedding ceremonies. A groom's family might present a carefully made string to the bride's family, both as a gift and as proof that they had something of lasting value to offer. In some traditions, certain bead arrangements were worn only by married individuals, turning necklaces into visible markers of relationship status. The symbolism could extend into rites of passage. A youth reaching adulthood might be given their first bead necklace, often in a style reserved for their new social role. In this way, beads weren't just decoration, they were a wearable biography, marking key stages of life. What's remarkable is how these meanings traveled along the bead roads themselves. A style born in one region might be adopted in another, carrying its original symbolism or acquiring new layers of meaning as it was reinterpreted by the receiving culture. Over time, this created a shared visual language that could bridge linguistic and cultural divides. You might not speak the same words as a stranger from far away, but you could recognize the significance of the beads they wore. And of course, there was the sheer human desire to impress. Just as people today might choose a certain watch, pair of shoes, or hairstyle to make an impression, Stone Age individuals selected bead arrangements to turn heads at gatherings. The great bead roads didn't just move materials, they moved styles, turning remote groups into part of a vast, slow-moving fashion network. Beads could even serve as storytelling devices. A trader might recount where each section of a necklace came from: the blue stone from the northern mountains, the white shell from a southern coast, the tooth bead from a great hunt in the savannah. In this way, wearing beads was like wearing a map of your personal and ancestral journeys. The deeper you look, the more you see that the value of beads wasn't only in their material. A plain shell could be priceless if it carried the weight of family history or symbolized an alliance. Likewise, a bead might be treasured not for what it was, but for who gave it and under what circumstances. This symbolic richness meant that when beads moved along the trade routes, they carried more than just physical beauty. They carried ideas about identity, about belonging, about what it meant to be human in a world where survival depended as much on social bonds as on physical skill. And as we'll see next, this symbolic role would make beads even more important, not just as adornments, but as one of the first true currencies in human history. Before coins clinked in leather pouches and before gold was weighed on scales, there were beads. They were small enough to carry in bulk, durable enough to last for years, and most importantly recognizable to almost everyone you might meet along the great bead roads. In many ways, they were the first proto-money. Now, to be clear, no one in the Stone Age was calculating interest rates or running a bead bank, but beads worked as a form of currency because they had what economists today would call intrinsic and social value. Intrinsic, because making them took time and skill. Hours of drilling, grinding, and polishing meant they couldn't be easily faked or replaced. Social, because everyone agreed more or less that they were desirable. That agreement turned them into a reliable medium of exchange. Imagine you're traveling, and you need food, water, and safe passage. You could offer meat, but meat spoils. You could offer hides, but they're bulky. Beads fit in your hand, can be stored indefinitely, and can be traded again later. They're the perfect portable wealth. And they weren't all valued equally. Just like modern currency has denominations, bead values varied by rarity, craftsmanship, and the distance they had traveled. A common ostrich eggshell bead might be worth a handful of nuts or a small piece of dried fish. A rare carnelian bead from hundreds of kilometers away could secure a high-quality spearhead, a large hide, or even an animal. There's evidence that in some areas, beads weren't just traded, they were used to settle debts or formalize agreements. A string of beads could seal a hunting partnership, ensure the repayment of a promised gift, or serve as collateral for borrowing goods. These exchanges weren't tracked on paper, of course. They were remembered, reinforced through repeated meetings, and the social obligation to uphold one's word. In communities where reputation meant survival, failing to honor a bead-based agreement could mark you as untrustworthy for life. This bead economy also helped stabilize relationships between groups. When one group suffered a poor hunting season or faced resource scarcity, they could turn to trading partners for help, offering beads in return. The receiving group might not need the beads immediately, but they knew the items would hold value in the future. In effect, beads created a form of credit, trust, that help given now would be balanced later. Interestingly, beads may also have been used in competitive displays of generosity, a practice anthropologists call prestige exchange. A leader might give away an impressive quantity of valuable beads to another group, signaling both their wealth and their willingness to share. This could strengthen alliances and discourage conflict, while also boosting the giver's status. Because beads could pass through many hands, their history often added to their value. A string known to have traveled far, crossing rivers, deserts, and multiple trading hubs, wasn't just an ornament, it was a story, a proof of connection to a wider world. In this way, some beads may have gained legendary status within communities, much like heirlooms today. Their portability also made them useful for risky journeys. If you were traveling a dangerous route, carrying beads instead of bulkier goods reduced your load and increased your chances of survival. If you reached a point where you couldn't continue, you could trade a small number for food or shelter without giving away all your wealth at once. The bead as currency model had one more advantage: it encouraged repeat interaction. If you paid someone in beads for a service or resource, they had an incentive to keep trading with you, especially if they knew they could pass those beads along to someone else for something they needed. In this way, the Great Bead Roads weren't just a one-time flurry of exchanges, they were sustained, living networks of economic relationships. By functioning as one of humanity's earliest forms of standardized value, beads laid the groundwork for the idea of money itself, and just as later coins bore the images of kings and empires, these early bead currencies carried the mark of their makers: the polish, the drill holes, the unique combination of materials, each one a tiny signature in the economy of the Stone Age. Trade doesn't end when the goods change hands, it continues in the form of the relationships those goods create. Along the Great Bead Roads, the exchange of beads wasn't just about getting something you needed right now, it was about weaving long-distance relationships that could last for years, even lifetimes. Picture two groups living 100 kilometers apart, separated by rivers, forests, and territories claimed by others. They might only meet face to face once or twice a year, perhaps at a seasonal gathering. When they part, they carry away not just goods but also obligation. The beads exchanged act as reminders: I know you, we have traded, we are connected. These long-distance ties had real benefits. If a traveler from one group arrived at the other's camp months later, wearing beads known to have been given in past exchanges, they would be recognized and welcomed. The beads were physical proof of an existing relationship, a kind of prehistoric passport. Without them, you were just a stranger. With them, you were a known ally. Marriages often became part of these alliances. A marriage arranged between members of distant groups didn't just unite two people, it united two trading partners. Beads frequently served as part of the bridwealth, sent with the bride to her new home as both a gift and a symbol of the enduring connection between her birth group and her new family. Over time, these marital ties acted like strong knots in the web of the bead roads, creating stable channels of trust and exchange. Some alliances went even further, evolving into what anthropologists call fictive kinship. Through repeated trade and gift-giving, often with beads as the central items, groups began to treat each other as if they were extended family. Obligations of hospitality, protection and resource sharing extended across great distances, bound together by the simple, consistent act of bead exchange. Of course, maintaining these long-distance relationships wasn't always easy. Routes could be disrupted by environmental changes, animal migrations, or conflict with third parties, but beads had a way of bridging those gaps. If direct contact wasn't possible, intermediaries could carry beads along the route, passing them from one group to the next, ensuring that the relationship didn't fade. And the relationships weren't only about survival, they were also about prestige. Being known as a group with strong ties to distant communities boosted status at home. Leaders who could produce exotic beads, rare shells from far coasts, brightly colored stones from distant mountains demonstrated both their network's reach and their skill in maintaining it. These connections also encouraged cultural exchange. Along with beads came stories, songs, dances and techniques. A bead style from one end of the network might be copied and adapted hundreds of kilometers away, blending with local tastes to create something new. The result was a slow but steady diffusion of ideas, carried bead by bead along the roads. This social dimension of the bead roads gave them remarkable resilience. Even if a particular trade route fell out of use due to drought or conflict, the relationships it had created often persisted. When conditions improved, the trade could restart more easily, because the trust and mutual recognition were still in place. If you think about it, the Great Bead Roads were as much about people as they were about objects. Every bead that traveled far carried not just its material value but also the invisible threads of obligation, friendship and kinship. In a world without written contracts or centralized governments, those threads were the closest thing there was to an international alliance system. So when a trader set out with a pouch of beads, they weren't just moving goods, they were maintaining a human network. Every exchange was a chance to strengthen ties, secure future safety, and keep the pathways of trust open across vast and sometimes dangerous landscapes. The beads themselves might eventually break, be lost, or be buried with their owners, but the relationships they forged could outlast generations. proof that in the Stone Age the smallest objects could hold the biggest bonds. Every great network has its experts, and along the great bead roads, those experts were the bead makers. While many people in Stone Age communities could shape a shell or grind an eggshell disc, certain individuals or entire groups developed reputations for exceptional skill. These were the specialists, the people whose work was so precise, so beautiful, that their beads were sought after far beyond their home territories. Becoming a master bead maker wasn't a quick process. It required not only steady hands but also a deep knowledge of materials. A skilled maker knew which shells drilled cleanly and which ones tended to crack, which stones could take a high polish, and which animal bones would hold their shape for decades. They also understood where to source the best raw materials, information that was often guarded as closely as a family recipe. These specialists, likely trained apprentices, passing down techniques through demonstration and repetition. Imagine sitting beside a master, carefully imitating the angle of their drill, or the rhythm of their polishing strokes. It might take years before you could produce work worthy of trade. In some communities, bead-making skill may even have been inherited along family lines, ensuring that certain clans became famous for their craftsmanship. Specialization changed the economics of the bead roads. If you were known for producing the finest ostrich eggshell beads or the most symmetrical stone discs, traders might travel specifically to acquire your work. This meant you didn't have to wander far yourself. Your beads would carry your reputation outward. In fact, some archaeologists have identified bead signatures, subtle stylistic features unique to particular makers or communities that can be traced across hundreds of kilometers. These specialists also experimented. New drilling methods, polishing techniques, or decorative features like engraving and staining could set their work apart. A fresh design might spread rapidly along the bead roads. If it caught the eye of traders at seasonal gatherings, other communities would copy and adapt it, but the originator's work might still be recognized as the real thing, just as certain workshops in later history became famous for particular styles of pottery or textiles. Because high-quality beads were valuable, bead makers could wield influence within their communities. Their products brought in needed goods, strengthened alliances, and sometimes elevated their social standing. They might be given priority in food distribution during lean times, or their families might be more welcome in distant camps because of the relationships their work had built. Some specialists probably traveled themselves, either to sell directly, or to work in other regions for a season. These itinerant bead makers carried more than just their tools, they carried knowledge. A maker visiting another community might teach new techniques in exchange for shelter or food, spreading innovations across the network. This movement of skilled individuals was another way the bead roads transmitted not just objects, but ideas. There's also evidence that some beads required collaboration between specialists. A stone bead might be quarried and roughly shaped in one location, drilled in another, and polished in a third before it was finally strung and worn. Each stage might be done by the best available craftsperson for that task. This distributed production meant that beads could embody the labor and expertise of multiple communities, making them even more symbolic of the connections between people. In a way, these Stone Age bead makers were the first global artisans, their work traveling vast distances and crossing cultural boundaries. Without them, the great bead roads would have been far less vibrant, fewer designs, less variety, and less incentive for traders to seek out distant connections. Their legacy is still visible today. When archaeologists unearth a perfectly symmetrical ostrich eggshell disc from tens of thousands of years ago, they're not just finding a bead, they're seeing the fingerprint of a master craftsman, someone whose skill and dedication helped weave the web of connections that stretched across the prehistoric world. And as these artisans' creations traveled the routes, they often faced harsh and unpredictable conditions, something the travelers themselves knew all too well. That's where our story turns next. The environmental challenges that shaped every journey along the Great Bead Roads. Traveling the Great Bead Roads was never a gentle stroll through a postcard landscape. The routes crossed deserts, mountains, rivers, and forests, each presenting its own set of hazards. Every trader, messenger, or wanderer who carried beads across long distances had to reckon with the elements and with the other living things that called those landscapes home. In the arid stretches of the Sahara, or the Kalahari, water scarcity was the greatest threat. The prehistoric Sahara wasn't always the vast sea of sand it is today. Thousands of years ago there were more lakes, rivers, and grasslands, but even then dry seasons could turn routes into dangerous gambles. Travelers had to memorize every waterhole and seasonal stream, sometimes digging into dry riverbeds to find hidden pockets of moisture. Beads were light, but the weight of water containers often slowed the journey to a crawl. Mountain passes posed their own challenges. The Ethiopian highlands, the Atlas Mountains, or the rugged ridges of East Africa could be treacherous, especially during sudden storms or seasonal snow. Narrow trails wound along cliffsides where a slip could be fatal, not just for you but for the pouch of beads you carried. In high-altitude regions, cold nights were deadly, and traders had to carry enough clothing, fire-making materials and food to survive until they reached lower ground again. Rivers could be both lifeline and obstacle. Crossing them was rarely simple. Without boats, you might have to wade or swim, risking losing your goods or being swept away by a current. In crocodile country, those crossings became even more nerve-wracking. The knowledge of where to cross safely was often closely guarded and passed down through generations. Then there was the wildlife on land. Big predators, lions, leopards, hyenas, were more than just background scenery. A lone traveler or small group could be stalked for hours. Smaller hazards abounded too. Snakes hidden in tall grass, insects carrying disease, and the constant irritation of biting flies. And let's not forget human hazards. Not every group along the bead roads was friendly. In some territories, outsiders might be driven away, robbed, or even killed. This is where the social value of beads came into play. Wearing recognizable styles from allied groups could mean the difference between welcome and hostility. But even with alliances, misunderstandings could escalate quickly in places where there was no shared language or custom. Weather was a constant gamble. A sudden downpour could flood lowland routes, forcing detours. Extended drought could dry up vital water stops. In coastal areas, storms could make certain stretches impassable for weeks. Seasoned traders learned to read the sky, smell the air, and listen for subtle cues in bird and animal behavior that signaled changing conditions. Travelers also had to carry enough food for the journey, often dried meat, nuts, or gathered plants. Hunting or foraging along the way was possible, but it slowed progress and could draw unwanted attention from predators or rival groups. In some areas, traders cached food in advance, burying supplies along the route during an earlier journey to retrieve them later. Despite all these dangers, people kept traveling. Why? Because the rewards outweighed the risks. A single successful trip could bring back beads and goods that elevated your status, secured vital alliances, or simply brought joy to your community. Over time, these routes developed an unwritten rhythm, knowing when to travel to avoid seasonal hazards, where to camp for safety, and who to trust at key waypoints. The environmental challenges also shaped the routes themselves. Some paths were abandoned for decades when conditions became too dangerous, only to be reopened when the climate shifted. Others became legendary for their difficulty, with only the most skilled and daring traders attempting them. The knowledge of how to survive these stretches became part of the cultural heritage of the groups who traveled them, a map written not on paper but in memory and story. Through all of it, the beads themselves were remarkably resilient. Sheltered in leather pouches or sewn into clothing, they survived dust storms, mountain freezes, and monsoon rains. And when they arrived at their destination, they carried with them the silent testimony of the journey, a story of endurance, skill, and connection that made them all the more valuable. Those journeys didn't just bring beads, they left traces in the ground, especially in one kind of site that has given modern archaeology some of its clearest windows into the bead roads, burial sites. If the living traded beads along the great bead roads, the dead often carried them to their final rest. Burial sites are where some of the most striking evidence of prehistoric bead exchange has been found. Frozen moments in time where personal adornment, social status, and cultural meaning converge. Archaeologists love burials because they're time capsules. Unlike beads dropped along a trail or lost in a camp, burial goods tend to stay where they were placed. This makes them ideal for studying the spread of materials and styles, and in many Stone Age burials, beads are everywhere, strung around necks, sewn into clothing, scattered over the body, or gathered in small pouches placed beside the deceased. Some of the earliest and most famous examples come from sites like Sungir in Russia, where two children, buried roughly 34,000 years ago, were found covered in thousands of ivory beads, each one carved, drilled, and polished by hand. It's estimated that producing all those beads could have taken tens of thousands of hours. That's not just ornamentation, that's a monumental investment of labor, signaling the children's importance in their community. In Africa, burials at sites like Border Cave and Ankapuni Yamuto have revealed strings of ostrich egg-shell beads accompanying the dead. The materials used sometimes came from far-off places, proving that even in death, people were adorned with goods that spoke of long-distance connections. These weren't random inclusions, they were deliberate choices, perhaps meant to honor alliances, symbolize the deceased's role in life, or equip them for whatever lay beyond. The arrangement of beads in burials often reveals cultural preferences. In some cases, beads were concentrated around the head and neck, suggesting the deceased had worn them as necklaces or headdresses. In others, they were sewn onto garments or shrouds, indicating a beaded outfit worn into the grave. Some graves even show patterned arrangements of beads, which might have mirrored designs used in life for ceremonial clothing. Burial beads also tell us about the social reach of a person. A body interred with exotic shells from a distant coast, or brightly colored stones from far-off mountains, was in effect a billboard of that person's connections. It signaled that they, or their family, had ties to the broader network of trade, alliance, and prestige. And the symbolism didn't stop at the edge of the grave. The inclusion of valuable beads in burials meant those items were deliberately taken out of circulation. This act may have been a form of sacrifice, showing that the community was willing to part with wealth to honor the dead. In economic terms, it was a costly choice. In social terms, it was a statement of loyalty, love, or respect. What's particularly revealing is that burial bead styles often match those found in everyday contexts. This suggests that the symbolic and social meanings of beads in life carried directly into death. Wearing beads was not just a matter of personal vanity, it was a deeply ingrained cultural practice that followed people into the afterlife. For archaeologists, these burials are crucial in mapping the Great Bead Roads. When similar bead types turn up in graves separated by hundreds or thousands of kilometers, it's clear that those communities were part of the same trade web. Sometimes a bead found in a burial is the only clue that a connection existed between two distant regions. In a way, the dead have become the bead road's most reliable messengers, while the living carried their treasures across shifting routes, facing hazards and changing seasons. The dead kept their beads still, locked in place for tens of thousands of years. When we unearth them, we're not just finding artifacts, we're uncovering proof of an ancient network that linked lives, cultures, and landscapes across impossible distances. And as time passed, the techniques used to make these burial treasures evolved, just as the bead roads themselves adapted to changing technologies. That's where we're heading next. How innovation reshaped the way beads were produced and traded. If you laid out the oldest beads beside the youngest ones from the tail end of the Stone Age, you'd see the same basic idea, small portable ornaments, but you'd also see a world of technological change in how they were made. Over tens of thousands of years, bead production evolved, shaped by advances in tools, materials, and techniques. These changes didn't just alter how beads looked, they transformed the speed, scale, and style of the Great Bead Roads themselves. In the earliest days, bead making relied entirely on the simplest stone tools, sharp flakes for drilling, coarse sandstone for grinding, and muscle power for everything. Drilling a hole in a stone bead with just hand twisting could take hours, sometimes days. That meant beads were rare, slow to produce, and highly valuable. Then came the innovation of rotary drilling. By attaching a pointed tool to a shaft and spinning it first between the palms and later with a bow drill, makers could pierce materials much faster and more cleanly. The bow drill in particular was a game changer, a simple curved stick, strung with cord, that when drawn back and forth spun the drill tip at high speed. This reduced production time dramatically and allowed for more consistent results. Suddenly beads could be made in greater numbers, feeding the growing appetite along the bead roads. Tool material also evolved. Early drill tips were often flint or chert, but as people discovered harder stones like quartzite and later, even copper in certain regions, they could work tougher materials without wearing out tools as quickly. This opened the door to new bead materials that had once been too labor-intensive to bother with, like harder agates and denser shells. Polishing techniques improved too. Instead of rough grinding alone, makers began using progressively finer abrasives, crushed stone powders, fine sands, even plant-based materials to achieve a mirror-like sheen. This wasn't just vanity. A high polish made beads more appealing for trade, since they caught the light better and stood out more in gatherings. Decoration became more sophisticated as well. Some bead makers started engraving patterns into the surface lines, dots, spirals, adding extra layers of visual interest. Others experimented with multi-material beads, combining, for example, a core of one stone with inlays of another. These composite beads weren't just harder to make, they also signaled higher status for whoever owned them. Color treatments also emerged. While ochre staining had been around for ages, People began experimenting with heat-treating certain stones to deepen their color. Carnelian, for instance, could turn a richer red when heated carefully. Such enhancements increased a bead's desirability and its trade value. These technological shifts had ripple effects along the bead roads. Faster production meant more beads circulating, which in turn meant more groups could participate in trade networks. More varied styles and materials meant traders could tailor their goods to different cultural tastes along their routes. Specialized production centers may have emerged during this period, places where bead making happened on a larger scale, with multiple artisans working together. Archaeologists sometimes find concentrated workshop sites, littered with drill tips, polishing stones, and piles of unfinished beads. These hubs could churn out products for wide distribution, making certain styles recognizable across vast distances. Increased production also allowed for greater experimentation. Some styles spread rapidly along the trade routes, becoming near universal in certain regions, while others remained unique to a small area, serving as local identity markers. This diversity meant that a skilled trader could walk into a gathering and immediately spot which beads came from where, reading them like a map of the bead roads. By the late Stone Age, bead-making technology had transformed the industry from a slow, labor-intensive craft into a thriving, adaptable trade that could respond to changing demands. And as climate and cultures shifted, these advances helped keep the bead roads alive, even as the world around them began to change. But not all change was growth. Sometimes the same forces that expanded the bead networks also set the stage for their decline or transformation. That's where the final stretches of the great bead roads lead us next. No trade network lasts forever, not even one as old and adaptable as the great bead roads. Over thousands of years, the very forces that once fueled their growth began to reshape or even dismantle them. Climate change, migrations, resource depletion, and the rise of new materials all played a role in transforming these ancient pathways. One of the biggest factors was environmental change. In regions like North Africa, shifting climate patterns slowly turned green corridors into arid stretches. Lakes and rivers that once served as vital waypoints dried up, cutting off the easiest routes between bead-producing and bead-consuming communities. Where water vanished, people moved or they simply stopped making the long, risky journeys. Migration was another game-changer, as populations relocated, sometimes due to environmental pressure, sometimes due to conflicts. They brought new trade preferences with them. A group moving into a new region might bring their own bead styles, disrupting local demand for older designs, or they might abandon bead making entirely in favor of other ornament traditions. Then there was resource depletion. Over centuries, the most accessible deposits of high-quality stone or the easiest shell beds to harvest could be exhausted. When raw materials became harder to obtain, production slowed. In some areas, bead making continued but shifted to cheaper, more local materials, which might not have carried the same prestige on long-distance routes. Meanwhile, technological advances created competition. In certain regions, metalworking emerged. Copper, bronze, and eventually iron offered new kinds of ornament, bracelets, rings, and pendants that could rival or surpass beads in perceived value. The skills and tools used for bead making were sometimes repurposed for these new crafts, drawing artisans away from traditional production. Social and political changes also had their effects. As communities grew larger and more organized, trade routes sometimes came under the control of specific groups. What had once been open, loosely connected networks could become restricted or taxed. If a powerful community decided to block a route or demand higher tribute, smaller groups might abandon it altogether. In some places, the bead roads didn't so much disappear as merge into new trade systems. The same paths that once carried strings of ostrich eggshell beads might later see the movement of metal goods, woven textiles, or agricultural products. The beads themselves might linger as decorative items, but their role as the primary currency of exchange faded. Cultural shifts played their part too. As styles changed, certain bead types fell out of fashion. A design that once signaled high status might come to be seen as old-fashioned, or even meaningless to younger generations. Without the shared symbolism, the social value of some bead types eroded, and with it the incentive to carry them over long distances. Archaeological evidence sometimes shows this transition in abrupt layers. One season a site is rich with beads of a particular type, the next layer shows them reduced or replaced by other goods. The story is rarely one of sudden collapse, it's more like a gradual fading, as the focus of trade slowly shifted elsewhere. Yet even as the original bead networks declined, their legacy remained. The skills developed by bead makers didn't vanish, they adapted to new materials. The relationships forged through centuries of exchange left lasting cultural ties between once distant groups, and in some remote regions, bead-making traditions continued almost unchanged, surviving well into more recent historical periods. The great bead roads may have transformed or diminished, but they didn't vanish without a trace. They left behind a blueprint for long-distance exchange, portable goods with agreed-upon value, shared meeting points, and the careful balancing of risk and reward. Those same principles would guide the trade networks that followed, whether they carried bronze tools, spices, or silks. And while the ancient roads were changing, their echoes were already influencing the first truly global systems of human connection, a legacy that still glimmers in the archaeological record today. From here, our final stop will be to step back and look at that legacy, the enduring impact of the great bead roads on the way humans connect, trade, and see themselves as part of a larger world. When you step back and take in the full span of the great bead roads, you see more than just a prehistoric trade network. You see the roots of how humans learned to connect across distance, difference, and danger. These bead routes were never just about ornament, they were about building the first real webs of interdependence between far-flung communities. For tens of thousands of years, the movement of tiny, hand-made objects stitched together people who might otherwise have lived and died without ever knowing each other existed. Beads traveled through forests, over mountains, across deserts, and along coastlines, sometimes in the hands of their makers, sometimes passing through a dozen intermediaries before reaching their final wearers. And in that movement, something powerful happened. Strangers became allies, and isolated camps became part of a larger living network. The legacy of the bead roads is visible in the archaeological record, but it's also etched into human behavior. The very concepts of value, exchange, and symbolic display were sharpened along these pathways. People learned that beauty could be traded for safety, that rarity could carry prestige, and that small tokens could stand in for trust between individuals who might not share a language or a homeland. Technologically, the bead roads drove innovation. The demands of producing attractive, durable, and portable goods pushed early artisans to improve tools, invent new techniques, and experiment with materials. Socially, they laid the groundwork for systems of reciprocity, debt, and diplomacy, systems that would later underpin agriculture, city life, and statecraft. Even their invisible side routes, known only through the scatter of archaeological finds, speaks to a kind of proto-globalism. A bead found hundreds of kilometers from its source is a fossilized moment of connection, proof that human curiosity and cooperation reached far beyond immediate survival needs. And their influence didn't vanish when the bead roads themselves shifted or faded. Later trade networks, from obsidian routes to the Silk Road, followed many of the same principles: high-value, low-weight goods, meeting points timed to seasonal resources, and the forging of long-term social bonds to smooth the way for future exchange. The beads were the prototype, the proof of concept. Even today, the echoes are there. We still trade in symbols, we still give gifts to secure relationships, we still measure wealth in part by the ability to display beauty from far-off places. A modern necklace bought on holiday in another country isn't functionally different from a carnelian bead traded in a prehistoric market. It's a portable piece of the wider world, worn close to the body. When you think about it, the great bead roads weren't just the first long-distance trade network. They were one of humanity's first experiments in seeing ourselves as part of something bigger than the small circle of faces we saw every day. They proved that trust could travel in a pouch, that beauty could be a bridge, and that connection could be built one small gleaming bead at a time. And in the quiet of a museum case or the soil of a forgotten burial, those beads still whisper their story, that long before we built ships or carved roads in stone, we were already walking toward each other, stringing the world together, piece by piece. So now, as we leave the great bead roads behind, let the pace slow. Picture the last traders of the day gathering by their fires, the light flickering across necklaces and bracelets laid carefully beside them. The air is cooling, the wind carrying scents of distant cooking fires and the faint salt of the sea, or the dry spice of desert air. Somewhere in the darkness you can hear the soft click of beads, as a hand absent-mindedly rolls them on a cord. The roads themselves fade from sight in the dusk, but you know they are still there, marked in memory and in trust, ready to be walked again when the season turns. The hazards, the distances, the endless steps, they all melt away into the knowledge that at the far end of this journey, there will be a welcome, a trade, a story shared. You can almost feel the smoothness of a bead in your own palm now, warmed by skin, its edges telling of the hands it has passed through. Each one is a link between people, between places, between times, and though the faces change, the road remains, as constant as the human desire to reach out and be known. Let that thought settle in as your breath slows, and the imagined weight of those beads becomes lighter and lighter. Somewhere, in some other time, the fires are burning low, the voices fading into night, and the bead roads, strung across the land like constellations on earth, rest in the darkness until the next footsteps carry their light forward. Sleep, now, traveler, the roads will wait. Sweet dreams.